Karen Salyer McElmurray won an AWP Award for Creative Nonfiction for her book, Surrendered Child, A Birth Mother's Journey, and the Orison Award for Creative Nonfiction for her essay, Blue Glass. She has been nominated for her essay, Speaking Freely, for a Pushcart Award, and she's currently teaching at Gettysburg College and at West Virginia's Wesleyan Low Residency MFA program. She's in conversation tonight with Abigail DeWitt, who is the author of News of Our Loved Ones. Of course, like all of our events, this one's free, and you can go on our website. We'll post the link to Karen's book, Wanting Radiance, and to Abigail's book, News of Our Loved Ones. It's my pleasure to introduce Karen Salyer McElmurray and Abigail DeWitt.
There. Am I unmuted? Yeah.
I was not.
So thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you, Stephanie, for having us here tonight. Thank you, all of you who are here. It's really nice to see so many friends' faces. It's really a treat. It's the silver lining of the pandemic is that you see people you wouldn't see otherwise. So thank you all for coming, and not just Patricia and Stephanie, but all of Malaprops for saving us all in so many ways. So I just wanted to add a little personal note to the introduction to Karen. I've known Karen since the late 1980s. And the first time I saw her, we were both adjunct instructors at UNC Asheville. And I'm sure many of you know that being an adjunct anywhere is a nightmare. So we were there being adjuncts, but I didn't know her. And I went to the cafeteria one day and I saw this person across the room who, as a matter of fact, Karen's a few years older than I am, but she has always looked much younger. And across the hall of the dining room, I saw what I thought was a young student, maybe a freshman, reading. I don't remember what the book was, but I remember that it was a book I love. And I looked at her and I thought, oh, look at her. She's just like I used to be. And then somehow we met and I read her work and I was completely blown away. And I realized, oh, this is not who I used to be. This is really a force of nature in writing. And then she just started winning prizes and prizes and prizes and writing just one gorgeous book after another. I really have been in awe of her writing since I think it was '89. But anyway, so I'm really thrilled to be here with Karen, and I'm going to turn it over to her so she can read from Wanting Radiance, and then we'll chat.
Well, thank you, Abigail. Thank you. I just have to add quickly one personal story about you. One of my favorite things, yes, I know, I didn't tell you I was going to do that. Back in the day, we would all get together and have these wonderful meals. And I remember it being near Christmas, and you decorated your Christmas tree with earrings. And I just always keep that memory. Anyway, thank you to everyone for being here, and special thanks to Stephanie and Patricia and to Malaprop's bookstore. I mean, it really is important that we have these events to keep the idea of community going, connection via writing. I'm just so thankful for these kinds of events. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I was going to start, I'm not going to read a long time because I mostly want Abigail and I to discuss. We've got a lot of things we'd like to talk about in terms of this book and in terms of our writing lives. Wanting Radiance is my newest book, and one of the things we talk about when I workshop with my students, we always talk about what the work is about. You know, on the periphery, I guess this book is about palm reading. It's about tarot cards. It's about ghosts, both literal ghosts and metaphoric ghosts. It's about lost love. It's about doubting love in a huge way. It's about the desire to rediscover one's past, who one really is at the deepest level. And, you know, it's also very much about a mother and a daughter. And the prologue begins the book, the mother is lost, there's a murder. So it's kind of a murder mystery too. So I thought what I'd like to do is read just a little bit from each of those characters, them telling their stories as they remember it. In the first excerpt, each chapter has a title, and this first chapter, starring the narrator of this novel, whose name is Miracelle Loving. The title of this chapter is Spirits in the Two-Step at Dill's Five and Dime. Dill's Five and Dime is a country punk fusion bar in an imaginary version of Knoxville, Tennessee. And at this moment, what Miracelle does is she tells fake fortunes. She lives on the road. She drops in bars, diners. She tells fortunes. She convinces people that she knows the truth when she by no means knows it and knows that she doesn't know it. At this moment in this chapter, she's just been talking to a woman trying to persuade her to have her cards read. Pink lights flashed above the bar, signaling 2 for 1 on the drinks. Her man, Answer, blonde-headed, was saying, had gambled away everything he owned but his skivvies, and I was kind of listening, but I wanted another lemonade and vodka. A song started up, one about a fortune teller named Madame Rue, her and her gold teeth and love potions. Blonde was telling a story about Mr. No Good, how he'd bought her this really nice diamond ring, and it was too big, but she wore it in the shower next to her heart on a string, and it near about turned her finger green. Cheap and no good, and didn't that prove itself every dang time? That was the very second when it all happened, and in a way I would have said was mystical if I was into such things. I felt this itching low down at the back of my neck. The itching turned to words, and then to a voice way too familiar, one I hadn't heard in years. Miracelle, you ought to have more heart for women like her. I nigh about fainted. The voice had a pleased with itself sound. Look at you, fortune teller girl. I shrugged and concentrated as I told Blonde how I'd seen my share of smooth talkers and bad men, and why, look at me. By that time, she was poking around in her purse for the $20 for half an hour's card reading, though I'd already talked with her that long, minus the cards. She was telling me about how Answer had moved in, moved out, taken over everything in her life. What are you doing, girl? The voice said, and my heart rippled. Smoke rings rose from the bar crowd, and I followed their trail to the filthy ceiling, felt up under the table, found wads of old gum, like they'd tell me what was what. By that time, the voice was inside my ear, and it had taken a seat. Just when you think I was gone for good, Miracelle Loving. A voice like Southern comfort at the bottom of a glass. My name's Beatrice, Blonde said, her eyes pleading as a little dog's. She handed me a 20 folded up into a neat little square. Hush, I said, I've got to listen. She looked a little scared, like maybe one of us was crazy. Listen to what? I didn't answer because I sure didn't know. Haints, they used to call them, ghosts, stray souls, nothing but leftover voices from too many times before, and I'd had my share. A woman alone, why, she could hear just about anything, even the ghost of her own mother. So that's a little bit of an introduction to the narrator of this book, Miracelle Loving. Excuse me. I'm going to read a little bit, a very, very condensed version of another chapter in which she will meet Miracelle's mother, whose name is Ruby Loving. And this is from a chapter called Then and There. The time in the first chapter is 1993. The time in this chapter, it begins in 1947, on the day of Ruby Loving's birth. Then and There. Her first memory was reaching out of darkness toward the faces of the women ready to receive her. She held back, safe in the damp, warm inside, her eyes open, already not sure of the world she was about to enter. Wait, her heart told her. Then they took hold of her hands, pulled her out into the light, into a room that smelled of tobacco and herbs, a room where her mother cried. A beautiful child, the women said, but her mother saw right away that her daughter had more than her share of mortal flaws. Just look at your hands, Esther said when Ruby was 6 or 7, and sure enough, they were rough from mud in the yard, her palms threaded with fine cuts from the broom straw and catbrier she plucked behind the house. Maybe Esther wanted a son instead, Ruby grew to believe, and so she took the broom straw and wove it into things that seemed more solid than herself. She filled tiny baskets with hatched out robin's eggs, stones as smooth as she could find. Or maybe Esther had wanted no child at all. Ruby worked to disappear, hiding inside quilts at the end of the bed, vanishing inside closets and coats in the summer heat. Her hands were so far from her own body, she saw them as two lost things she no longer wanted. If there was such a thing as a mother's love, Ruby saw it fall through Esther's fingers like rusty water. And if the world held beauty, Esther kept it close. She pulled the clothes all clean off the line, breathed their scent when she thought no one saw, kept bottles in all the colors she could find, blue, red, brown, hanging by twine across the kitchen window. Late evening, she sat at the mirror by the dresser, her own slender hands parting strands of her hair to make a long braid. Tell me about love, Mama, Ruby said, as she wound stray bits of thread on a spool. There's no such thing, Esther said. There's only God. God decided how cold that winter would be. He fixed the summer days so hot you couldn't touch a doorknob on the outside of the house. He made autumn so lonely, Ruby stared far off at the sound as she sat on the porch while her daddy sang songs so beautiful they melted the air. While he played, Ruby held on to thunder as it traveled over top of the ridge. The light from Radiance, the streets and their houses, stores and their shelves filled with movie star magazines. What she did those nights was teach herself to read cards. She laid out rounds of aces and hearts from her daddy's poker deck. Cards had power. They could tell your future if you just learned how. Ruby turned the cards one by one, let them tell her about places and times she'd never seen. She held a card balanced on the end of her forefinger like it was something she'd someday need bad at the end of a long road, and she already knew what it was. Love, a prize to equal her longing. Queen of Hearts. That was her first card one night. A crown all royal and those proud eyes. That was who Ruby wanted to become, though she did not yet know the ways and means of it. Her next card was a deuce. The road she'd take someday, ones beyond their hollow and all its mountains wrapped around, roads she could not yet imagine. All she knew was how she sat on the porch in the dark, long after the fiddle was laid in its case, long after the last of the night birds quit calling. The last card she drew was a one-eyed jack, and her gut told her the meaning, shadow man. Out there somewhere in the far black night, filling up with rain. It was summer, and the day had been so hot, there had been nothing at all but flashes of light. The light was hot its own self, and it was trying to push through the skin of the day. She held her hand out, palm up, beyond the porch's eave, and then Ruby heard it, the first tiny whisper of rain on leaves. She trailed a finger between her lips and tasted the rain like it was him. So those are some pages. There's questions. I guess we'll come back to those later, right?
That's right. If you and Abigail want to
Okay.
begin your conversation, that'd be great.
That was gorgeous, Karen. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Really, just really gorgeous. And
Well, I just have to say, you've read online now. There's such a thing to be reading into sort of the either in a way. You're there, all your faces, but you're reading to no one. It's what a strange experience and a good one.
you did it really well. You seem like. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about, in everything you write is intensely lyrical. The language is always exquisite. But there's also, in this book, as in all of your books, this a very dramatic plot. You know, it has these very page-turning. It's a page turner as well as this deeply poetic piece of writing. And so one thing that you and I had talked about, and I want to hear more about, is how you maintain the lyric impulse as you're struggling to make sense of the narrative arc, if that's something you can talk about.
Oh, I can try. I can say, first of all, that it's the quintessential question for me. As far back as I can remember, with me in the world of writing, I have written poetically. I mean, when I was 9 years old, my best friend lived across the road from my grandmother's house, and she played a 12-string guitar and wrote poetry, and I wanted to be her so badly. And I began to write poetry, and I wrote poetry really all the way up until I went to graduate school at University of Virginia. And then around that time, some mentors began to say, but your poems are so narrative. And so I went in the direction of writing fiction. But the fiction retained that poetry, that impulse toward the poetic. And that's where I've stayed for years and years. Those are indeed the writers I love most, poetic lyric prose. Mm-hmm. Love Virginia Woolf. I love James Agee. I love, Leslie Marmon Silko. Those are just three of my favorite writers. And I love that impulse toward this rich kind of image complicated writing. And I admit that over the journey of writing over these years, sometimes that impulse toward the poetic kind of overwhelms the work. It's about itself. It's about image. In fact, I admire writing in which images are the plot. Now, images move as much as an external event. But by the time I got to this book, I was also setting myself a challenge. I really, really wanted to write something that had that external plot balancing the lyric voice. I think I'm getting there. I think that I thought a lot about what I would choose for the vehicle for the poetic voice. I admit, watching a lot of television movies. I mean, there's plot, surely I can do that. Or fairy tales, steal a fairy tale like Eowyn Ivy and the Snow Child. And it's beautiful language, gorgeous language, but there's this plot of a fairy tale. But I finally decided on this sort of, this murder story that in a way I took from my love of old-time ballads. So it's kind of borrowing from the world and applying this lyric voice to what I borrowed, I guess.
Yeah.
You struggle with the same thing, don't you, with the lyric and the...
I do. And like you, except I didn't write poetry until I went to graduate school because I wouldn't call what I wrote poems, but that is what I wanted to do. The challenge for me is, and maybe I just need to do more borrowing of plots. As I try to work out my own plots, I lose sight of the lyrical voice.
Of the what?
Of the lyrical impulse. And that then it's painful. It's like, why am I doing this? Because that's the thing I care about.
I mean, part of my struggle also is, I guess I would call it discovering the plot. And, you know, this book took like 7 years or something. I was constantly discovering and rediscovering the plot. The next time, maybe might be a good idea to begin with the plot, you know, to begin knowing not how everything works out, but to have a general idea, you know.
Well, I think you'd get bored.
You do?
I do. And that actually, I'm sort of going to skip ahead to a different question, something else you and I had talked about. You know, when the writer gets surprised, and I don't want to give away anything about the plot of this book, but there's something very surprising that happens. A discovery that the reader makes, that and the character makes, that Miracelle makes, that are very surprising. But it's also, you know, it's that kind of perfect surprise that also, once you actually come to it, feels inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the process of, you know, what it was like for you to discover that surprising thing that we won't name.
Well, I think that in the past, particularly with the book called Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven, I had a very clear idea of the last moment of the book in my mind. And I'm like always writing toward that moment. By the time I'm here with this book, I hope at least that I'm beginning to let the characters come alive and lead their own lives and make their own decisions. So partly that was going on. I also had the great blessing of working with someone who helped me edit the book and pushed me, nudged me in this direction of plots and twists and turns. I think that somewhere paired with those two, having learned something from this mentor and the determination to let characters lead their own lives, I'm getting somewhere, you know. I'm always telling myself, well, now I'm ready to write a book, you know, now I'm ready to begin. There's that, you know, you have that feeling too.
All the time. Unless I'm in the middle of writing a book, in which case I think, no, I'm still not ready. But yeah.
I'm still going to be like training to write a book, and I'll be like on a walker or something and having to like barely get over to the desk or something. Oh, now I'm ready to begin.
Yes. Well, another thing about this book that sort of blows my mind is how much you clearly know. That
I don't know that I know. Yeah.
Right now, I'm just talking about music, about museums of curiosities, about different jobs, about geography, and you had mentioned once you described your brain as a museum of curiosities, not just
or like a button jar or something too.
And I would just love to hear more about that, and also what you didn't already have stored in your mind, what kind of research you may have had to do.
I think that I really love that we talked actually yesterday a little bit about some of these ideas, and that idea of all that I know in this book, all of these details, some of them seem to be research-based. And I really like that metaphor, that museum of curiosities. That comes from Gettysburg College had this great exhibit, and there were like curiosity boxes in a way, this whole room. Like there was a collection of eyepieces from London. There was a collection of feathered fans from southern United States and South America. These things gathered incidentally. And I guess I do think my brain kind of works that way. I'm aware that I experience the world and I see a lot, and I'm learning more and more to see more as I'm more present with myself and the world. And so I accumulate details. And so I'm able to come back to them in the work later. I don't really keep journals or anything like that with these details. I sort of, the element of surprise again. I surprise myself with what I take out of the curiosity box and be able to use or imagine. Research, that's an interesting one for this book. Previous books, I researched bunches of stuff. I remember with Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven, researching early photography methods like glass plates for slides. I remember researching what people wore in, the late 1890 or something. And then in another book, I ended up researching black holes and vortices in the town of Sedona in the Southwest. This book, there was some research. I guess I remember researching paper mills. Would be in a paper mill. I researched Appalachian ballads, particularly ones about women and murders, those Appalachian murder ballads. But, the biggest research, and this is a really odd thing to say, I've lived now quite a time away from the mountains that I love, away from Eastern Kentucky. So sometimes, and I don't mean this in an odd way, but sometimes going home, which right now, can I go? No, but going home is kind of like research in a way, because I recapture the sound of voices, the way people talk, or I'll recapture how people look or how people are, researching by immersing myself in who I really am from where I'm from. So adding to the boxes of curiosities in my mind.
That's really interesting. I think of every trip home as research.
Really?
It never occurred to me that was odd. I actually was wondering if I could take it off on my taxes. But
I feel like, I want to just be fully present when I go see people there. And instead I'm like, oh, that's a good thing you've said. Let me write that down.
I don't think writers can help it. I don't think there's a way around that. But, the other thing you and I talked about was how much you have experienced in the course of your life that, leads you to have this museum of curiosities in your brain, and how, in that sense, you're a lot like the character of Miracelle. And I do want to mention that if you type Miracelle, autocorrect will change it to Miracle. So will you talk about the ways in which you and Miracelle are alike?
Well, I'm sure that Miracelle and I are alike in that we've lived in numerous towns. We've lived in numerous states. In the last years, of course, I've taught mostly. I've, taught in a lot of different ways. But I've also had, like Miracelle, any number of jobs over time. At one point, my strangest job was for a while working in selling cemetery plots at night. I would go in like at 10 and 11 and be on like a telemarketer or just doing all the stuff, working in greenhouses and landscaping. I've done a whole lot of that. So I have that experience of, like Miracelle, of doing this and that. And so like getting by, making always, I hope, writing the most important thing. And I guess for Miracelle, there's the most important thing. And she, at the beginning of this novel, I don't think she knows what that most important thing is. For her, the most important thing becomes knowing where she came from, knowing the identity of family that she's lost, never known. And the more I wrote this book and the more I'm with it even now and talking about it, I realized that Miracelle and I are very alike in terms of love. I think that I, for many years, learned all too well not to trust love, not to trust very much at all. And Miracelle and I share that journey of, I wouldn't call it becoming vulnerable, but being more open to the experience of love, of wonder, of possibility, something like that.
Yeah. Can you talk more about how writing this, I asked you about the difference in the kind and amount of research you did between your two books, and now sort of on the other edge of the spectrum of questions, how it has been different with each of your books emotionally to write them, the different emotional experiences of writing these books.
Oh, that's a very hard question. I think that with Strange Birds and the Tree of Heaven, I was still just learning to rein in my prose. I think it's overwritten. I think that what I'm saying is that I was learning, and maybe not, I was emotionally invested, but there's a darkness there, deep-seated kind of darkness in relation to God, in relation to family, in relation to staying alive even. I go forward in time, there's my memoir, Surrendered Child, A Birth Mother's Journey, that still has it has a great deal of darkness, of sadness, of loss. But I honestly believe, I can't speak for my own work the way others can, of course, and don't even want to begin to, but I honestly believe this book is moving in the direction of more light. That's why this title was important to me, Wanting Radiance. So emotionally speaking, I feel closer to this book because I feel closer to the possibility of my own heart. I think that would be the answer to that.
I love that. And I think that that's really true, that, having read your previous books, which I loved, but this one is definitely moving towards more. This one is really full of light. There's pain and there's a murder.
But that's, yeah.
It's really, really full of light.
And another difference for me, somebody whose criticism I really value in reading my memoir said something about how it felt very detached from experience in some way. And I think indeed keeping, the question of emotion, keeping it a little at arm's length because of the intensity of it. Here I feel connected to the experiences that I'm writing. And so that would be a difference in them emotionally. You look puzzled there.
I just really disagree with that assessment of Surrendered Child. Nothing about it felt detached to me. But in terms of your experience of feeling, I can't, that's, yeah. I just disagree with that assessment of Surrendered Child. I want to just check in with Patricia or Stephanie how we're doing for time.
You're doing great. You have about 3 more minutes before we're going to open it up, unless you got some more things you want to ask.
I do have one more question. I just want to read from this this beautiful Amazon review and ask you a question because of that. And I'll just condense it here. It is the most poetic, lyrical, and moving novel I've read in a very long time. From the first page, the dialogue, imagery, and metaphor knocked me out. As I moved deeper into the book, I fell in love with Miracelle Loving's voice, and the structure, which toggles between past and present, slowly revealing the main character's background as the plot moves forward, kept me hooked. Not only will this book's mystery pull you in, but McElmurray tackles big subjects along the way, among them family, grief, memory, and the patriarchal treatment of women and the land. And so in our remaining 2.5 minutes, I'm going to ask you the question. If you would talk about, so it is in many ways a book about Appalachian women, and how they've been disempowered, and how the characters in the novel reclaim their voices or find their voices if they didn't have them. And if you had 2.5 minutes worth of things to say about that enormous topic.
Well, I think that the book, in ways I'm more aware of as I reread it now for these events, is inhabited by all kinds of different women. You know, Miracelle is at the forefront of the women who are reclaiming the power of voice, reclaiming the power of who she is. But there's all kinds of other women. Like there's the woman there's a long scene in a church. There's a, you know, it's sort of an evangelical church. And this woman comes up on the platform, and the preacher is telling the whole time the story of Ruth in the Bible, Ruth who follows. And so there's that woman. There's a woman in a grocery store. There's a woman, you know, the old woman who does tattoos. There are these various women who, in one way or another, are questioning or their lives in some way. And that's not even the best way to answer that. The best way to answer it would be to think about something my mother used to say. She would describe the women in my family, my cousins, and she would say, oh, Candy, now she's with somebody, he's so good to her. And I would think, well, I sure hope so, you know. So that was sort of in the back of my mind the whole time. These women who, you know, is someone being good to them, or, you know, are they being good to themselves? Or are they taking it? So what does that being good to mean? And, you know, the question about women in the land, I've got to work that out in my mind, how that's working in this book. Do you have a thought about that?
Oh,
that's a hard one, I know.
Not one that I feel like I can articulate. Yeah, I have a feeling about it more than a thought about it.
Yes, me too.
But it would take me, it would take me a while to articulate it. So I'm going to leave that.
I mean, basically, I think in many ways it's a book in which any number of women either question or power, experience lack of power, or try to become, or eventually become more powerful, you know, and Miracelle would be the quintessence. Go ahead.
Well, one of the things that really strikes me is you have all these, in some ways, disparate women, but they're all really connected in one way or another.
Yes.
And they all, in one way or another, murders notwithstanding, both wound and sustain each other. But it, you know, the image I have is of tree roots, how they are all connected underground. That book, the famous book about the tree roots speaking to each other.
What book?
It's somebody.
No. Somebody just, Gary, do you know what she's talking about? No. He's saying, but we can't hear Gary.
Maybe
The Overstory.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Which I confess I haven't read, I've only heard about, but that image of the trees, of the roots connecting with each other, communicating with each other. That's the image of this book that I have, you know, of this forest of trees, these, you know, being these different women, but they're all really, their roots are all sort of winding around each other and affecting each other. And I love that about it.
And maybe that in itself connects to the idea of landscape.
Right.
And this connection, interconnection, not even community, that's not the word for it. It's something much, much more intuitive, more spirit-based than that.
Yeah.
And that connection, maybe, as my friend Ardith, who I think is here, said, it makes it a book in a way about kind of redemption in a way, in the end.
It's very much a book about redemption.
And the way that these stories, these women's stories connect. And not every story is by any means beautiful, but the way they all connect, making a fabric that is both light and dark.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that was longer than 2 minutes, wasn't it?
And that's totally okay, but it was a wonderful transitional moment because Ardith had a question about
Really?
the issue of redemption. So I'd like to pose it to you both and kind of see how you want to build off of that. Ardith says, if we consider redemption as defined as release from error or a reclamation, does
Release
Miracelle
from error?
Release from error, E-R-R-O-R, error.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Does Miracelle seek or experience a transformation by the end of the book? And then she has an additional, you mentioned the book as being lighter than your previous book. Is there a message of hope to be found in the book? And what is it? So is there an experience of transformation for your protagonist, and then the sense of lightness and message of hope in the book?
Abigail, you want to try that?
Say a resounding yes to both of those. Miracelle is very much transformed. I mean, totally transformed, and it's I feel, you know, a very hopeful ending. So yeah, it's a resounding yes to both of those.
I mean, in the end, excuse me, in the beginning, that was in the part that I read, she says something about being a mystic and, you know, if I was into such things. She's very dismissive of the power of ghosts and the spirit. But it's a ghost, you know, is it a real ghost? Is it a spirit? What kind of spirit is it? She follows the spirit toward trying to understand who she is and where she came from. So I think in the end, it is very redemptive. I hope it is. I'd like to hear you answer that question about your book. I mean, if that would be all right.
Well, I'll just say, I hope so.
I know that's the thing, isn't it?
It doesn't have one central character. It's a novel in 9 voices, each with her own story.
I mean, I'm thinking about those roots as you were just describing the interconnection of stories.
Yeah, I think there's, yeah. I mean, my book is my most recent book, News of Our Loved Ones, is about the, you know, if you're going to say it's about something, it's about the intergenerational impact of war. So I guess, I think the redemption in that book, I hope, comes from compassion for these people who have gone through these difficult circumstances. But the central image is the bombing of a town. So,
I mean, it's the same. I mean, the central, you know, plot device is a murder, you know.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But I certainly hope that I think the very last story in my, because it's sort of a novel of linked stories, I think the last one, I think there's redemption in it, and in the compassion for the characters, I hope.
There's a question that sort of connected to what you were talking about, the two of you were talking about earlier. What's real, what's not real, what do people believe is true or factual, I guess. And this is about writing memoir versus writing fiction. So what's that experience like, and the differences between writing in those two genres, and is the process different?
Well, to begin with, for me, I would have answered, when I was working on the memoir at the beginning, I thought it took me only like 2 years, and this is 7, but that's not really any measure of anything. I would have originally said, oh, memoir is just so much more accessible for me. It's so much easier because the story is written, you know, the narrative arc is there, and it's my life, you know, or some section of my life. The more I write, both essays now, personal essays and fiction, maybe I'm just in the study too long, but it's more like genre and gender even. I mean, I think things in this world are fluid. And I'm not even entirely sure if the distinction between memoir and fiction is there as much for me anymore. The idea of what is there and what isn't there. I mean, there's magic in this book. There are ghosts, there are, things that are discovered that are they real? Is it magic realism? But I also believe that's possible in nonfiction. I think there's such a thing as speculative nonfiction. So to begin with, just to answer that in brief, I guess to begin with, I saw those things as quite distinct. But the more I work in both genres, the more I feel their connection. And I feel it with the possibility of transformation and magic in some ways.
Abigail, do you want to weigh in any way?
Just very briefly. So I've written some essays, but basically I don't write anything that, any book length thing that would be marketed as memoir. But I agree that the boundaries between the two are so fluid. All of my fiction is basically comes out of my family's experiences, and all of my characters are versions of me. At the same time, for me, the disguise of the character is helpful to me. I used to do theater, and I think of writing as acting on the page, where I've become a character. It's really me, but the life circumstances are different, and that I need that little, that little COVID mask that's so mysterious and you don't know who's behind it. I mean, it's obviously me, but there's a little something there.
I love that answer. I mean, I've always written family. I've written about my mother over and over and over and over again. But now you're right. Now that she's passed away this last year, the masks are many. I'm beginning to discover for her writing an essay, if I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
So something that people are always very interested in, and I'm certainly interested in it too, is carving out time to write. How do you do it? What's your process of the two of you? Pulling of hair, gnashing of teeth, super glue. What are you doing? How do you make it happen?
You want me to go first, or you want to go first? Oh, great. Well, I mean, to answer it in the immediate realm, I mean, you see the writing room right here. And it's not always a pretty place. Here, during the quarantine time, I found it really off and on very difficult to write. I don't know if Abigail, if you've experienced that or not. I have written drafts of 3 essays. They need lots and lots and lots of work. But in some ways, the writing kind of broke through the lethargy and the sort of the stalemate feeling inside me. But that's the recent writing. And you want to know, I've lost your question now. What's my routine for the writing? Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Usually, in writing, the routine is just all screwed up, let's just say, during this epidemic time. How can it not be? Usually for me, in the summers are my time to work, and I try to write. I get up really early. I have a dog that sticks her nose in my face at 6 in the morning, so I walk my dog really early, and I try to do stuff, at least sit in front of the screen and stare at it until about 1. All of that changes once I'm teaching. I just don't know. I mean, I try really hard to take days. Well, I'll say I will not do teaching stuff on Friday. At least take the morning. It's harder for me to write when I'm teaching. So, Abigail?
Well, it's been really hard for me to write since March.
You know what I mean about the stalemate.
Yeah, it's, I sort of feel like in order to deal with the state of the world, I've shut down on so many levels.
Yes.
That it's, you know, my great skill, you know, is watching Netflix and crossword puzzles. That's been my pandemic skill. In general, now that my daughter is grown, and that I teach just very sporadically, finding the time is not the problem. It's finding the courage. It's, you know, I have a wonderful writing studio that's across the driveway from our house. And, you know, once I'm out there, I feel, you know, just this incredible sense of peace and openness and light. But sometimes just crossing the driveway to get there, it's as if there were armed men waiting for me in there. And I just, you know, how I can cross the driveway. So yeah, that's much more the trick for me now that I'm older. When I was younger, trying to find time was a constant struggle. You know, having a younger child and teaching full time. And I was always, you know, I still come across these sheets of paper where I've written a schedule, you know, and I will grade from this time to this time. And then for 2 hours, I will write. And then you know, and it's painful to see those, to come across those pieces of paper because it never worked that way.
Boy, no kidding. Have you ever seen that book, The Woman Who Sleeping with One Eye Open is the title of it. It's a collection of essays. She's nodding her head. But anyway, it's edited by Marilyn Callett and Judith Ortiz-Cofer. And somewhere in the book, Judith is talking about teaching like an adult ed class. And she has all these women who like did factory work. And they would get up like at 5:30 in the morning and have that beautiful like hour and a half before they hit, or 2 hours before they hit 5 to 7. And, you know, I think, oh, I'll do that. But you know, it's, it's harder but I admire that greatly, but no. So you don't have exactly a disciplined schedule.
No, I don't. It's always better if the more quickly I get out to the studio, the better. Yeah. So, but you know, I'm a night owl, so I stay up till like 2 in the morning and I get up around 10. So the great thing is if I can be in the studio, you know, if I'm there by 11, that's going to be a really good day. That's going to be a really good day. If I don't get distracted with the terrible news.
News, that's the thing. I start my whole day off. I'll wake up, you know, 6, time to walk the dog, and first here's my phone beside the bed and I'm looking at the news, and before I know it, my eyes are like this big and I'm just, my whole body is frozen. So.
I think this is a really, I mean, some people are using this time to create amazing work, but I hear from so many people, and I'm saying this for anyone in the audience, those of you who are writers, if you are experiencing this, you know, too, that it's really hard, even if you have the time, even if you've got the excuse never to leave the house, that this is not an easy time to get to that sort of still, quiet, true place.
Are there any books or a book in particular, as we're wrapping up now, a book that you might recommend, Karen or Abigail, that you've read, you loved, or you've come back to, or everybody should check it out at some point?
Well, I do have one. It's an Untouched House. And the reason that I discovered this author and this book is thanks to Justin at Malaprops.
Who's the author?
Oh, his name is, he's Dutch. Willem Frederick Herman's. And it's this tiny book, you know, it's like, it's the size of my hand.
Yeah.
And, but it's a war book because that's what I love. But it is probably the most beautiful war book I've ever read.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I mean, it's harrowing. You have to like harrowing, but it's exquisite. And another thank you to Malaprops, because without your staff picks, I never would have found it.
Karen, what about you?
Well, the last thing I read, that'd probably be the easiest way to answer it, and it was a rereading. Has anybody read Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous? I was just laid out. It was just so gorgeous. And I mean, it works like an extended poem, but it also has this wonderful, wonderful characters and this wonderful narrative arc. Yeah, I love that.
That was one of my favorite books that I read in the past year.
Well, I want to thank you both so much. We're at the top of the hour, and to honor Zoom time, I want to definitely be cognizant of that. Karen, congratulations on your great success. And there's nothing, I think, more gratifying than having such a great supportive fan and colleague like you have in Abigail, who clearly does give you a close read. And I just think that's a wonderful part of this conversation that I
Well,
heard.
the feeling is completely mutual. Abigail, you're one of my favorite people.
That's so sweet. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this Zoom this evening. Stephanie very kindly has been behind the scenes posting links to some of the topics and books that we've been referencing in this conversation. And I want to encourage you to check them out. This will be posted on our YouTube channel sometime in the future. Karen, many congratulations again. Thank you so much for taking time out of your teaching prep and to join us. And we look forward to hearing more from you. I know we will. Good luck with the semester. And Abigail, you as well. You know, stare down the armed men keeping you from your writer's studio. We know you've got the courage to do it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Can I just say a hello to everyone again? It's so good to see your faces.
It really is. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Bye.